What's going on, YouTube? Welcome back to the channel. Welcome back to another video. My name is Jake, and I've been programming professionally for over 10 years now, both in my own private business and for Fortune 500 companies. And today I wanted to do a small video on some of the technical terms that you might hear when you walk into anywhere with a software engineer in this new era of AI. The goal here is we're going to go over two distinct terminologies, walk through a little bit about how they're used, and get you up to speed so that you would understand, hey, this is how everything's connected, this is how everything plays together when you're talking to a technical person or colleague. So diving in, you guys probably saw the title here. We're going to be talking about APIs and MCP. Now, if you are super familiar with APIs, I'll leave a bookmark here where you can skip it, but I wanted to give a quick overview of APIs. Now, API is Application Programming Interface, and it was first coined in the 1960s. It's essentially the way that we push and pull data anywhere on the internet between two different systems. And the global standard for APIs is REST, or a RESTful API. And basically what that means is we have a couple of verbs and methods that we use to push and pull that data. So really common ones for a RESTful API would be get, put, post, and delete. And kind of based on the verb and method, you can kind of understand what you would be doing when your code calls that API endpoint. So an example of this might be an API where it has one endpoint on /users and it accepts an ID. And it's a get endpoint. So I would write code on my end as a software engineer to I call that endpoint on the /users, provided the ID, let's say ID 5, and that endpoint would return to me the entire user object of employee or user number 5. Now, for me to understand and know that that's what that endpoint does, whoever makes the API, whoever's responsible for this data, has to build out documentation and has to tag that endpoint with that documentation. So I, as the software engineer on the receiving end, can then go and make my code conform to that endpoint. Now, this is important to know because if the endpoints or the APIs are extended, maybe they have a get user endpoint today, and then tomorrow they build a delete endpoint on the users, where I can pass an ID in and delete that user from the database. I would then have to go into my code and say, okay, I want to support that functionality. Let's go ahead and write a delete path, call the endpoint for the API that deletes the user, and then ship my code, right? And that cycle can take quite a while, especially if you have to adapt to the API every time it changes. Now, for most APIs in the world, they're really static. They don't change a whole lot, maybe some versioning. And so there isn't a whole lot of development after you've solidified which API you want to use, but there definitely can be some migrations and some upgrades that you'll have to do for long-term support if you are integrating with a totally different system across the internet. So that is really APIs in a nutshell. Basically just a way that we push and pull data between two systems given a very specific contract that is defined by the owners of that API. This has been really popular since the 2000s internet bubble, and it's really been the backbone of web dev for essentially the last 30 years. Now, we have APIs, and we have this new term, MCP. MCP was introduced in 2024 by Anthropic, and MCP stands for Model Context Protocol. And the reason that they developed this protocol was to set a standard for the ways that LLMs interact with APIs. Now, in our previous example, if you had a user API that was able to get users and delete users, I could code against those API endpoints. In this new age of AI development, what we want to do is we want the LLM to reason around which endpoint it should call to achieve the user's ask. And so you can imagine a system where you have an LLM now handling the business logic of what's happening, and you can actually provide to that LLM the user's MCP server. And that would effectively allow the LLM to list out all of the tools that this API allows me to perform and what those tools do. And so one of the tools might be getting users. So you would pass it ID of 5 and you get back this giant user object. And so if a user asks, hey, what's the last name for employee number 5 or user number 5? The LLM would be able to reason, oh, I have an MCP server that I can call, make an API request to, get that data, and then return it as an answer to that question. And it does this at runtime. Previously, in the API world, if the API schema or format changed, as a developer, I would have to go in and update my side, the calling side, to match those changes. In this new era of MCP, we provide the LLM the ability to dynamically reason through the API using this protocol. And so what it can do is it can say, okay, the owner of this API has updated their API, and before they only had a get endpoint, now they have a delete endpoint. I have to write no extra code, and my LLM now has the functionality to be able to delete users if that query comes up. And so this is why MCP is so powerful, because now we have a standard way of LLMs communicating with APIs. Prior to this, there was a lot of different players, right? Ever since 2019, when LLMs first came onto the scene, and a little bit after that, when we started using them to code, there were a bunch of different standards of ways that people were actually interfacing between the LLMs and APIs that, actually held the data. Now with MCP, we've standardized that, and so you can essentially write one connector and have it connected to any number of different clients that want to integrate with this user's MCP, let's say. So that's a really basic breakdown of the two API and MCP terminology that you might hear when talking to a technical colleague or in any room you might be in. Let's talk a little bit more about the drawbacks or the positives of using MCP in this new world. So like we had discussed before, MCP is done at runtime. So in the middle of the running of the code, the LLM can reason through which tools it has access to and then decide which one is appropriate to call. Now, that's fine if we have a very narrow scope, and it's always recommended to keep your MCPs in a very narrow scope, because if you start adding tool after tool after tool, and the only request you ever get is to get a user, you're flooding the context of the LLM with a bunch of stuff that you don't need. And so that is something to call out here, is that when an LLM returns a response or it's handling a response, you only have a certain amount of tokens for that entire round trip. Now, MCP, the definitions there, they're pretty lightweight, but when we get to adding hundreds of MCP servers, then you start actually degrading your context where the model can't reason through all of that. And that brings up another drawback that I want to touch on here, which is tool collision. If you do end up adding hundreds of MCP integrations into your LLM calls, there's a very high probability that two tools in that list have very similar descriptions, very similar names, and very similar inputs and outputs, to the point where the LLM will actually get confused and call the wrong MCP tool at the wrong time. And that can be very confusing to debug, especially when you expect it to call one and it decides to call a different one. And we can fix this a little bit with prompting and adding additional context, but it's better just to narrow down your MCP surface area and keep your solution focused instead of having to deal with the collisions. Now, based on all of that information, if you guys have any questions on MCP or API or anything I didn't cover here, stick around because I'm going to be doing a more in-depth breakdown on some more technology terms that you might hear. And I'm really curious if there's a question that came into your mind as you watch this. If there is, drop a comment down below, and we'll see you in the next video. Peace.